Quality, comfort, and grip at an affordable price. Whether it's our standard, pro, or elite socks, there's an option for everyone. Try a pair for yourself now at puregripsocks.com. What makes an Adidas Predator a Predator? Is it the rubber striking element, providing extra grip on the ball when shooting, or is it the cosmetics of a fold-over flap tongue? Or is it both of those things? Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the brand new Adidas Predator 25 League FT, the second-tier takedown model in the new Pred 25 lineup, and your cheapest option if you want that signature fold-over flap tongue, with this boot retailing for $100 versus the $280 that you'd have to pay for the top-end model. That's nearly a third of the price. However, while you do get the very good-looking and certainly trendy at the moment fold-over flap tongue held down by an elastic strap, what you don't get are the rubber strike skin elements. Instead, you're getting what they call strike scales, which is basically just some minor texturing on the surface of the upper with color filled in to make it look like a striking element, when in fact, it's just paint. Where similar to the elite tier Predator 25s, the League option is also more of a refresh rather than a complete redesign, meaning that these definitely share a lot in common with the Predator 24 League FT that I reviewed last year and honestly wasn't overly impressed with. Having said all of that, despite the similarities, they have actually made some positive changes to this year's iteration of the budget-friendly tongue version of the Predator. So if you want to learn what's good, what's bad, and realistically whether or not this genuinely counts as a pair of Adidas Predators, we're going to go over all those details in today's video, including how they fit and feel on feet. So if you're interested in learning more, please stick around, and if you are interested in a pair for yourself, you can pick them up below their normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the first link down below. And as always, if you enjoy hearing the truth of what's actually good and what's not so good, brutally honest opinions, don't forget to drop a like on the video and make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots as we head into 2025. So first things first, it must be said, on paper, quite literally nothing is different coming from the Predator 24 variation of this boot, in that it's still a fold-over flap tongue paired up to a hybrid feel synthetic upper with strike scale elements running through the top of the foot with a sole plate and stud pattern that isn't quite like what you'll find on the top end model, but is ultimately very similar in terms of the traction that it provides. What has definitely improved this year though are the cosmetics, and while this has absolutely nothing to do with performance, at the $100 price point, which is certainly less expensive than a top-end model, but not inexpensive, these look far more premium than last year's generation did. Where unless you really knew what you were looking at, and certainly from a distance, you'd have a hard time telling apart the $280 version to the $100 model, and that's not something that we've often been able to say about takedown model Predators. But it's whether or not they count as Predators that I think is the bigger question here, where the hybrid feel upper is kind of a more mesh-based synthetic material with that smooth leather grain finish on the surface. It's not quite the same as what you'll find on the top-end model, but from a grip on the ball perspective, it's not that different. These maybe have a little bit of extra thickness to them and generally have slightly more padding as well. Does it feel quite as premium as the hybrid touch you'll find on the elite options? Definitely not, but certainly for the price point, when you compare it to other synthetic football boots, these definitely hold their own. And again, because of this new surface texture slash finish that they've gone for, this does overall feel a lot nicer on foot as well as on the ball versus last year's variation, which had more of a cheap plasticky finish. What I'm much less thrilled about though are the new strike scale elements, where of course the design does mimic what you'll find on the top end elite models, where compared to the Predator 24, the striking element this time around has been kind of more streamlined and, dare I say, thinned out, where on the Predator League variation in particular, you can see it sits almost flush to the upper. There's pretty much no meaningful 3D texturing to it. When you run your finger along it, it's borderline completely smooth. And in terms of extra grip on the ball that it's providing, there pretty much isn't any. Where compared to last year, where it was still a strike scale element in that it's just 3D texturing with a paint fill to make it look like the striking element on the top end model, this actually raised off the surface of the upper significantly enough to where at least the texturing is noticeable to the touch, giving it almost a little bit of a gritty finish on the ball that did in turn provide some minimal extra grip. Obviously not a lot, not nearly as much as the rubber strike skin would on a higher end variation of the Predator, but at least there was some semblance of a striking element on this version versus the new one where realistically it's just a soft synthetic upper all the way through with no real grip, which for me is disappointing if we're going to call this a Predator model. It's kind of always been the case with the lower takedown Predators. They just don't have the rubber striking element, and I think that's such a defining characteristic of what makes this line special. And let's face it, if this football boot at $100 didn't have this fold over flap tongue, would anybody really care? Speaking of the tongue, it's actually pretty nice and very closely mimics what you're going to find on the top end model, which was also the case last year. It's the most premium element of this football boot for sure, and that it's this kind of soft microfiber type material. You of course have your more centralized lacing system with the tongue itself being a standalone tongue with that U-throat construction. And then of course you get that classic Predator fold over flap, where again, you do have the fake striking elements that would normally be rubber on the top end model right here, with of course the Adidas logo. It is that soft microfiber on the underside, and they of course give you that elastic strap, which doesn't have the same fancy graphics as the top end model, but ultimately serves the exact same job of holding the tongue down over top of your laces. Moving to the rear, nothing has changed from last year, which is a good or bad thing depending on personal opinion and preference, in that it is still on the shallower side in terms of fit, which we'll talk about later in the video, but it's not necessarily compromising to the overall experience. You get an internal plastic heel counter that's nice and solid. Obviously a low cut construction. The internal liner is a soft microfiber material with some targeted padding that is somewhat similar to the top end model, but I actually think you get a little bit of extra padding in the cheaper variation for whatever reason. Then the insole is kind of fully glued in, as you'll find from a lot of second tier takedown models from Adidas, which isn't necessarily a big deal, but you will find at the same price point or even lower price points from other brands, that insole will typically be removable. And it's not that you can't remove it, it's just glued down. So if you pull it hard enough, it will come out, but it'll take some of the foam along with it. And then moving to the base, you're going to find the takedown variation of the Control Frame 2.0 of that top end model, with this being a little bit thicker, a little bit stiffer, but generally still providing that solid underfoot feel that I think you would want from something bearing the Predator name. As far as Adidas takedown model sole plates go, this is above average compared to what we've seen over the last 10 years, so no major complaints from me there. And then as far as the stud pattern is concerned, it's pretty well identical across the board, regardless of price point within the Predator series, where if you've worn, again, an Adidas boot since 2010, almost every single pair has had some variation of this stud pattern, this featuring all triangular studs, where the traction overall is well-rounded. You get plenty of bite, you still get that freedom to twist and pivot. It's a solid stud pattern, but certainly nothing groundbreaking. And then when it comes to weight, like I try to do as often as possible, we have last year's version versus this year's version, and then just for fun, we're also going to weigh the top end Elite FT variation at $280, all in the same size, 9.5 US. We'll start off with the Predator 24 League FT, and you can see that they weigh in at 9.85 ounces, the equivalent of 279 grams. So obviously not on the lighter end of the scale. Then we'll throw on the 25 League FT, and you can see that they weigh in at even more, 10.1 ounces, the equivalent of 286 grams. And then again, just for fun, we're going to throw on the top end Elite model, and you can see that they weigh in at significantly less, 7.5 ounces, the equivalent of 213 grams. Making the new Predator League a little bit heavier than last year's for whatever reason. I'm not exactly sure why that's the case. And as an overall package, not a very lightweight pair of football boots in terms of what you can get in today's market, whether it's high end or low end. And then obviously if you are comparing it to the high end model, the weight difference is extremely noticeable. The top end Predator Elite is a very lightweight pair of football boots. The League variation, while less expensive, is not. On feet, this year's Predator League 25 definitely shares a lot in common with last year's, with two notable differences. Difference number one is that I think the finish on the surface being a little bit more premium this time around versus the more plasticky finish of last year's makes this upper just generally feel a little bit softer against your foot and generally more pliable. It has less of that kind of rigid plasticky sensation, which is definitely a good thing. Change number two is there does seem to be a little bit of extra width and volume in the toe box area, which again, I think makes for a better overall fit, or at least a more comfortable one on my feet with this year's versus last year's. What has not changed, however, is the shallow fit in the heel, which again, isn't so bad that they're unwearable. It's something that does take some getting used to, and obviously with some grip socks, you will have a more secure locked-in sensation when wearing the boots. But if you are somebody that likes to maximum flop your tongue and not use that top lace hole, which is the opposite of what I've done right here, you probably will find that your heel is going to spill out of the back of these boots quite easily. So if you are wearing them, realize that the heel is shallow and you should lace them all the way to the top in order to just make sure that they feel secure on your feet. If you really dislike a shallow fitting heel, however, then these probably aren't the best choice. From a width perspective, because of the U-throat construction and central lacing system, they do have plenty of adjustability and room for expansion. Granted, there isn't as much volume to these as what you're going to find again from that top-end Elite model. So for somebody with really, really wide feet, you might find that these don't necessarily have the width that you're looking for. However, I do think they'll work well for most foot types. And as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So like all the other Adidas Predators, if you are looking to get a pair for yourself, I would strongly recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. So in conclusion, there's no denying the Predator 25 League FT is a solid pair of football boots for what you pay if you can live with the shallower fit in the heel. But if we're also being brutally honest, it's a product that exists for people that want the look of a new Predator, but don't necessarily have the budget for that $280 top-end option. In other words, it's a product that, while good, is much more about style than it is substance. Where if you just really want that classic Predator look on a budget, I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with these. But at the same time, expectations need to be realistic in terms of how these feel, how they perform, and ultimately how they stack up against other options that you can buy for the same amount of money or less. Because from that perspective, it is not the best football boot at this price point. Where for me, a Predator without the extra grip from the rubber striking elements isn't really a Predator. This is a boot that's more about looks than anything else, where yes, there is a leather-like feel on offer that is a positive one, but for the same $100 from Adidas themselves, you can go and get yourself a pair of Adidas Copagloro 2s, have a better leather touch, have a more comfortable, better fitting pair of football boots, and even end up with a fold-over tongue held down by an elastic strap. Where maybe they don't look as cool as these, but for the same price, there's no denying that those are better overall football boots.